Welcome to episode 22 of the Yes You Coaching podcast. I'm your host, Anna Manning, and today we're going to be talking about being in your head versus being in the room. And you probably can hear that I have got a cold. And I'm like all up in my head. I was like, oh, maybe the audio won't sound very good if I'm going to record it, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, no, do you know what? This is a podcast about confidence and being confident in what you do. And the show must go on, right? Whether I have a cold or not. The people of the Yes You Coaching community want to listen to their podcast on a Friday morning. So here you are. Here's me, cold and all, talking to you about being in your head versus being in the room. But first thing, I have a new class, which is going to be a free class for the community. And there are 2 dates in January. I think it's the 4th and the 26th, but I'll drop a link in the show notes or you can go on the website. And the class is called Grow Your Confidence in 2023. I'm really excited to teach it because it is a culmination of everything I have learned and everything I know about what works with confidence building after having coached multiple hundreds of people on confidence coaching at this point, right? I see the same pitfalls over and over again. I see the same problems people are having over and over again. And I see the things that work over and over again to grow your confidence. So I have thought a lot about that, pulled all that together, and I've put it into a 60-minute class. It's going to be like a whirlwind of 60 minutes, but I'm really looking forward to teaching it. So I'm looking forward to welcoming you in. You can sign up in the show notes. And if you sign up, you also get a Christmas free gift, which is called 12 Days of Confidence. You see what I did there? 12 Days of Christmas, 12 Days of Confidence. I don't know why I had to explain that. I'm sure your brain isn't going as slowly as mine is this morning. But I was thinking about like a fun kind of gifty thing I could do for you for Christmas. And I thought, you know what? The thing I really want for Christmas is like more nice, confident people in the world doing what they want, saying what they want, being what they want, especially at work. And I thought, well, the best way I can help to do that is to share what I know. So it's going to be a little video series over 12 days, just like a little 1-minute video. And each day will be a different gift, which will help you to grow your confidence. So sign up for the class, the Grow Your Confidence class, and you'll get that automatically in your inbox in December. So on with the show. Today, we're talking about being in your head versus being in the room. You might be like, what on earth are you talking about? So, I'm talking about being present where you are versus being in your own head, and whether that is engaged in a conversation in your own head, whether that's thinking, whether that's just listening to the voices that are going on in your own head. The reason that I'm talking about this is because it comes up again and again when I coach people on confidence. If someone's telling me, do you know what, I do struggle in bigger meetings and I struggle in presentations and all of that, I always like try and find out, are you more in your head or are you more in the room? In those moments where you're finding it hard, are you like thinking? Are you listening to the voices in your head? Is it all going on inside? Or are you more just present and engaged in what's going on in the room? And without exception, people tell me, oh, more in my own head. I'm like more in my own head. And if this is you, until I actually ask people this question, most people have never really thought about where they actually are. Like, are they engaged with the people around them, whether that's online or in person? Or are they just engaged in their own head? And when I ask them the question, it becomes blindingly obvious to them that actually they are in their own head. So do you notice that there are times when you're in your own head versus in the room? And this might look like, and I'm not just talking about kind of everybody's mind wanders, right? Everyone has a moment where their mind wanders, whether that's like I'm really bored or I'm looking at the clock or my foot is itchy or I'm really thinking about this question. So I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about the moments where you have kind of unconsciously wandered into your own head and your own thoughts, and you're engaged there rather than being engaged where you actually want to be engaged, which is in the room and with the people that you're with. So I'll give you a recent example of someone who I was coaching and I said, you know what, I'm going to do a podcast about this because so many people tell me that it's a problem. And she gave me permission to kind of share her story here. So this particular client was in a meeting with some new potential clients of her own. And she said she was finding it really hard. She couldn't necessarily follow the thread of the conversation. She wasn't really that able to think on her feet. And she just wasn't able to engage in the way she wanted. And she was coming to me to kind of think it through, like what happened here and what went on and how can I do this differently next time. And what we found out when we started digging was she wasn't really in the room. And this was a virtual room, right? This was she was online, but she wasn't really in the room. She was more in her own head. She was consumed with her own thoughts about what was happening. She was consumed noticing that she, felt agitated and that she felt a bit fearful, and she was consumed thinking about how she was being perceived. So wanting to come across in a certain way and needing to come across in a certain way, needing to be articulate, needing to be interesting, needing to be engaging to these people who she, this could be a great new client for her and somebody that she really wanted to work with. And yet what was happening was she wasn't able to do any of that. She wasn't able to engage in the way she wanted. She wasn't able to be articulate. She wasn't able to really be with these people. And this is an incredibly intelligent, articulate woman that we're talking about. This is not someone who is not capable of being present and articulate and wonderful at what she does, because she's all of those things. But what we found was that when she was in her own head, she really wasn't able to be with them. She wasn't able to focus on what people were saying. She wasn't able to focus on the conversation. She wasn't able to just have a relaxed mind that could generate what she needed so that she could contribute and troubleshoot and all the rest of it. So you might be recognizing this. You might be like, right? It's not just this client. And I know it's not just this client because I've seen it many, many, many times. Like that could be a number of clients that I've coached. But do you notice this? Are there times when you're in your head versus in the room? So how would you know that this was happening? Some of the things that people have told me is that they might find it hard to articulate their point. They might find that their mind goes a bit blank. They might find they've kind of lost the moment. And then when they come to, the conversation has like changed tack, or the conversation's moved on, so that they're either not able to interject their point because the point was like, the point has been discussed and the moment has gone, or they've like suddenly been asked a question and they haven't been able to answer it. And this definitely happened to me once. I was in a meeting back in my old job. I was in a meeting with the Treasury, and it was in this kind of paneled room, and it's all very, it's all very fancy at the Treasury. And I think I possibly just was feeling slightly out of my depth with the whole situation. And I suddenly heard someone saying, "What's your take on that, Anna?" And I realized that I had no idea what they had just said. And I was looking at them, and everyone around this table was staring at me, and I was thinking, should I try and wing it? And I was like, no, I literally have no clue what they just asked me. So I had to say, "Oh, sorry, my mind just wandered for a moment there. Would you mind repeating that?" And it was a bit embarrassing, to be honest. Like, I wanted to put my best foot forward in that meeting. I wanted to be articulate. I wanted to be present. And because I was kind of worrying about the whole thing, I wasn't able to be. I wasn't able to engage in the way that I wanted. So I think a couple of things can be happening in those moments where we're in our head versus in the room. And I think the first thing is that our brains are being hyper vigilant. So our brain wants to ensure everything's perfect, right? It sees this as a potential threat, a potential kind of slightly dangerous situation. And when I say dangerous, I mean just a situation that you would want to be like slightly more alert for, right? I'm looking out slightly more, right? I'm aware of, I'm not just completely comfortable here. And our brain's like, right, must make sure everything's perfect in this environment, must be articulate, must be this, must be that, right? I must be on it, I must make a valid contribution, like all of these things. So our brain is like very engaged in being hyper vigilant about what is happening around us, and how we need to appear, and all of this. And I guess to our brain, that probably seems like a good thing to do. So we're like, our brain's like, okay, this situation could be dodgy. I really need to make sure that Anna is hyper vigilant about everything that's going on here. It's probably like well intentioned in terms of my wiring. My wiring is that my brain looks out for situations that might be risky or dangerous, and it asks me to like hyper focus on those. Well, but this situation is neither risky nor that dangerous, but I'm being hyper vigilant. So, because there's so much stuff going on in my head in those moments, because I'm being hyper vigilant, my attention is being drawn inside to listen to all that stuff that's going on instead of being able to be outside and present with the people that are in the room. So, that's the first thing. Our brains are like being hyper vigilant, and we are very engaged with watching that or being engaged with it. And the second thing I think is that we can get really stuck on focusing on how we're being perceived versus focusing on what we're actually doing. So when I say this, I see people kind of nodding and thinking, yeah, I do kind of focus on how I'm being perceived. So imagine that you're, in a meeting or you're giving a presentation, and you are looking out for every sign of how you're being perceived. So are people looking at you or not? Like, what do the expressions on their faces look like? Like, is your point landing? Are people smiling? Are people nodding? Are they agreeing with you? Like, all of this. When we're really focused on how we're being perceived, that is our primary focus. And as much as you think you're good at multitasking, I promise you that you're not. It is really, really difficult to focus on what you're doing when actually what you're focusing on is how you're being perceived. I always say to clients, if they're trying to do a presentation and they're actually just focusing on how they're being perceived and really being, super focused on that, I'm like, you delivering that presentation while you're really focused and being really vigilant about how you're being perceived is like you trying to do a presentation and doing gymnastics at the same time. Like, absolutely hats off to you if you managed to do a presentation that was even half decent, because you're essentially asking your brain to do two things at once. Your brain's like running on parallel tracks, and your brain is unbelievable in terms of its processing power, but it's going to struggle if what you're asking it to do, or if what it's doing is really focusing on how you're being perceived. How on earth are you supposed to really focus on what you're doing? Yeah, your delivery, your content, your connection with people, like all of that gets completely lost. And how could it not? So they're the things that I think are usually going on. Number one, your brain could be being hypervigilant, and you get very engaged with it and with what it's doing, and you're in your own head. Or you're really focusing on how you're being perceived, and that requires a lot of brain power versus focusing on what you're actually doing, or just being allowed to focus on what you're actually doing. So there's a few things that I want to share with you which can help. And if you are kind of coming to this conversation for the first time and thinking, do you know what, I'd never really noticed, but I do that. I don't think you really need to do anything other than just try to be aware of that. Just a minute while I drink some water. I think the most powerful thing that you can do is notice that you're spending a lot of time in your own head versus in the room. That awareness alone could be powerfully transformative in terms of how you're able to show up. Because if you can become aware of it in the moment, you can almost switch tracks. You can switch back into, okay, in the room. And you may even say that to yourself. When you notice you're in your own head, it's like you come to, isn't it, from like a dream state. You like suddenly come to and you're like, oh yeah, there's a room full of people here and they're all talking and doing things. I'd zoned out. What you want to try and do is just notice in the moment that that's actually happening. And once you notice, you can quite naturally bring yourself back into the room, and you probably will just bring yourself back into the room without actually having to think about it or really do anything. So that awareness is key. Now, because you've listened to this podcast episode that is all about being in your head versus being in the room, your awareness is now going to be heightened. And when you're doing this, when this is happening, the likelihood is that your brain is going to want to tell you. You're in your head versus in the room. Brilliant. That's what we want. We want you to notice, because simply the act of noticing what's happening is going to bring you back into the present moment. And that's what we want, right? We want you to be able to be in the moment, be with who you're with, be focusing on the content, be focusing on what's actually happening so that you can respond, interject, make your point, whatever it is that you want to do. The other thing that I think can be really useful is to have a way of kind of reorienting yourself in the physical environment. So what's happening when you're in your head versus in the room is that you're kind of lost in thought, you're lost in your head. If you notice somebody in a meeting with you that's lost in their head, you may notice that they've gone very still. Their attention is turned inwards. They're probably not noticing what's happening around them. They're not noticing their body or their physicality, right? They're just in their thinking brain. So if you notice that you're doing this, you might like to do something that reorients you into the physical. And that's, I guess, a fancy way of saying just like notice your body, notice what's happening around you. So, okay, I can feel right now, like if I'm noticing, I can feel that I can feel the backs of my legs on the chair. Or I can put my hand out in front of me and notice that, oh, yeah, I have a hand. My hand is in this physical environment. How would you do that? What would work to reorientate you into your physical environment? Would you blink a couple of times? Would you smile? Would you soften your abdomen? Would you notice your seat on the chair? Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. But something in the physical that can help bring you out of the mind and into the body. And the reason why I think it's important to get this awareness about when you're in your own head versus in the room and have like a way of bringing yourself back is because being in your head is not creating the result that you want in that moment. So when our brain's being hypervigilant to ensure that everything's perfect and we're being articulate and we're making a great contribution and all of that, and that everyone's perceiving us in the right way, that it sounds good, that in theory, that all sounds good. Want to make sure I'm doing a really good job. Everyone's like enjoying my points. Everything's landing. Great. That sounds great. But what it creates when we're focusing there is not that great. So we talked about the fact that you can't really do two things at the same time. So it's incredibly difficult to be in your head and be responding and being articulate and thinking about how you're perceived, and then actually having something that's working and landing well, extremely, extremely difficult. Plus, there's one other thing that I see happening to people when they're in their head versus in the room. And this is not necessarily happening. So this is an add-on, but I see it again and again. You can be putting a lot of pressure on yourself via all the stuff that's happening in your head. So imagine you're going into a meeting and your brain's like, you need to get this right. You need to be articulate. Everybody needs to agree with your contribution. Like, you need to make a powerful contribution. Like, you have to show that you're worthy of this job. And like, when you're doing all of that, not only are you focused in your own head versus in the room, you're also creating a stress response in your body. And what happens when you create a stress response is that you can't use your executive functions as well as you should be able to. Now, if you put your hand over your forehead, that is the part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that houses your executive functions. And that's the part of the brain that it's like the most developed part of a human brain. Doesn't even develop fully until you're 25. So that gives you some idea. Teenagers haven't got theirs fully developed yet, which might explain some of the random shit that they do. But the executive functioning part of your brain, this higher thinking part of your brain, is what you need to be online in order to synthesize complex information, connect ideas, imagine something which is different than something you have now, like create something new, strategize, plan. Like, all of those things are happening in the prefrontal cortex. All of those things are part of your executive functioning. But when you're all up in your head, creating a lot of panic and worry and being hypervigilant, you're creating a stress response, which is basically taking your executive functioning offline. So that's why, if you have moments like this where you're lost in your head and you're feeling fear, your brain goes blank. And people will literally say, my brain was blank. Well, it's funny that people say it because a part of your brain is kind of blank. When they do brain scans on people that are in a fear response, they notice that not as much activity is happening in the prefrontal cortex. So the part of the brain that you need to be online to do all the stuff you need to do in order to impress in that meeting is literally offline. It's not even being used. You're in a different part of your brain, which is responsible for responding to threats in your environment. Not that handy. So all of this happens when you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself. And I think the pressure on ourselves automatically increases when you're expecting yourself to do two things at once. So when you're expecting yourself to be able to listen to your brain critiquing like every move you're making and also deliver a presentation, like, that's a lot of pressure. Imagine your boss was like, right, I'm going to be in your ear and I'm going to be critiquing your performance all the way through this presentation or this meeting. Good luck. You'd be like, are you mental? That's the worst idea ever. As if I could listen to you in my ear, like bibbing on about the way that John is looking at me during this part of the presentation and how he doesn't look very interested. And at the same time, I'm trying to connect with people. I'm trying to deliver my presentation. I'm trying to do all this. Terrible. It would make me very stressed and very anxious, and it would take my executive functioning offline, thereby making it loads more difficult to do what I needed to do. I would be so frazzled that imagine if somebody asked a question in a Q&A, my mind would be a blank. If this is happening to you, know that it's just your brain behaving perfectly normally. When there is a fear response because there's a lot of pressure, your brain doesn't want to be thinking about some complex question about how you strategize on whatever it is. It wants to be hyper focusing on the fact that there's some kind of threat in front of you so that you can punch someone or run away. So if your brain's gone blank, that's precisely what's supposed to happen in these situations. But it doesn't help, right? Doesn't make that presentation any easier. So I want you to think about, stop worrying about whether you're making a good contribution. Stop worrying about whether you're going to be articulate, and take the pressure off. Take the pressure off instead of putting it on. When you take the pressure off, you'll find that you can be perfectly articulate and that you can contribute and that you can give a good account of yourself because you are articulate and you do know what you're doing and you have ideas and suggestions and contributions. All of those naturally exist within you. At the moment, you're just kind of getting in the way a little bit. Unconsciously, of course. So you need to find a way to take the pressure off. One of those can be reorienting yourself back into your environment. Another one is really thinking about what is putting the pressure on at the moment. How are you like putting the pressure on inside your own head, which is creating this result of you not being able to join in or engage in the way that you want? I had, when I first started as a trainee solicitor, I had this supervisor, my first seat, like with my new suit, my shiny shoes and all that. My first seat was in residential property. And my training supervisor was a lovely woman called Sarah. And she was efficient like I've never seen. And she spoke so fast. Everything she did was so fast that when I used to go and talk to her, I would be like there with 3 files thinking, right, I've got to ask Sarah about these files. And I would try and talk so fast that my words every time would get completely tangled and like come out as a jumbled mess. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself. I was like, right, Sarah needs me to talk quickly. Sarah talks quickly. She hasn't got time. I have to like make sure I talk really quickly so that she can just get through this. Well, and what was the result? She couldn't even understand what I was saying, let alone get through it quickly, because my tongue would trip and I would get all confused on my words and then my brain would be blank. And it was like, oh dear. That putting that pressure on just wasn't getting the result that I wanted at all. So you see, it is difficult to operate in the way that we want when we're putting all that pressure on ourselves. So, I hope that gave you some food for thought. I hope that allowed you to examine the times when you might be in your own head versus in the room, and to think about some of the things that might be going on when you are in your head, and whether that's creating the result that you actually want. And for the most part, when I'm coaching people on it, the answer is a big fat no. It's actually, ironically, creating the exact thing that they're afraid of. I'm really afraid of not being articulate. And therefore, I put a load of pressure on myself and I'm thinking the whole way through, must be articulate, must be articulate. And what happens? I cannot articulate myself properly. It's almost funny, but it's not funny because it is difficult to deal with. But maybe you can see the funny side. Good luck in coming back to the room and taking the pressure off versus being in your own head. You need it. Last off, if you want to work with me and build your confidence, I'm taking one-to-one clients at the minute. Let's get you to a position where you are as articulate in all of the environments you're in, regardless of people's seniority, and you can show up in the way you want to show up in all of the settings you're expected to be in. There's a link in the show notes. You can book a call with me. Last off, do book to join us in the class, which is in January. There's 2 dates in. I think they'll probably both fill, so go and get yourself a spot now. All right. Have a lovely week, everyone, and I will see you, hopefully minus my cold, next week. Bye.